Hey, this is Kirk, the bariatric carnivore. Well, what is a carnivore supposed to do? If you go to your doctor and if they ask you, what do you eat? What's your diet? Which is would be kind of surprising. It doesn't happen all that often, but when they do, what do you tell them? Well, I tell them with complete sincerity that I eat a whole foods modified Mediterranean diet with no ultra processed foods, and which is technically true because frankly, a Mediterranean diet is not something that's defined. Many people have said that, look, a Mediterranean diet is something that you occasionally sprinkle olive oil over your food, and that makes it somehow a Mediterranean diet. When you look and you try to find what a Mediterranean diet is, it really depends on what part of the Mediterranean you're in, because people in different parts, a lot of them eat pork, a lot of them will eat beef, goat, lamb. It depends on where you are. Some parts are going to have a lot of emphasis on fish because that's what's readily available to the population. So, trying to define something, but doctors have heard that a Mediterranean diet is good and healthy. So when you tell them you're on a modified Mediterranean diet, they get happy, and the conversation gets a lot easier. Well, why don't you tell them you're on keto low carb? Because that absolutely freaks them out. If you Google keto diets, one of the first articles you're going to run across is the dangers of a keto diet, according to Harvard Health. And one of their editor of that publication said that in the article that you really need to hold your saturated dietary fat down to about 7 to 10% of your calories, which would be ridiculously low for me. Um, why do they believe that? Well, frankly, there's no real good reason except for so-called expert opinion, and that is what is medical dogma. Everybody just kind of assumes that that's okay. And there's a lot of evidence that says no, it's not okay, or it's not really a problem, and their advice is bad. A couple of examples: the British Medical Journal went through and did an in-depth look at over 600 people and looked at their diets and found out that saturated fat, the amount of saturated fat you have in your diet, really doesn't affect your cardiovascular health at all. American Academy of Cardiology did a very in-depth meta-analysis just last year where they looked at all the different studies and tried to find a link between eating large amounts of saturated fat and heart disease and couldn't find it. Now, that doesn't mean that they threw up the white flag and said, hey, you can do anything you want and eat lots of saturated fat. They didn't say that. They didn't go that far. But they can't say that it's a nutrient of concern. Now, why doesn't your doctor realize, if you ask your doctor, if you've got high blood pressure, what they will probably recommend is what is called the DASH diet, which is the one that is recommended by the American Heart Association. It was based on a study back in the 1970s, which is basically a very low sodium diet, uh, low fat. And, if you want to eat boneless, skinless chicken breasts for the rest of your life with no salt on it, this is the diet for you. That's really, it's a very bland diet, with not much fat in it and major reduction in the amount of salt. Now, does this reduce blood pressure? Slightly. It does by a little bit. But what was interesting was last year they did a head to head comparison between a keto low carb diet where they held them down to, it was a genuine low carb diet finally, where they had people below 50 grams of carbohydrates a day. And then you had the DASH diet where they took away the salt and all the other stuff. And they compared the two head to head. And what was interesting was keto was body slammed the DASH diet on almost every category. It reduced blood pressure more than the DASH diet did. It reduced A1Cs, and people lost more weight, which should be okay. Let's get rid of the DASH diet and switch it over to keto. And unfortunately, it was crickets. I mean, nobody recognized that keto had won. It was not covered in the mainstream media much. It did not get a lot of attention, and your doctor probably didn't even hear about it either. That is what it is. Look, I mean, since the invention of the iPhone, we have been there's no societal consensus on virtually anything. We're all in our own little silos. Very few of us are now watching the mainstream news media. There's no societal events. There's no common culture when it comes to movies and things like that. And there's no real societal consensus when it comes to diet either. So we're all in our own little silos. We've all got our tribes. And some of, and all we can do is look and see, frankly, what works for us. And thankfully, we live in a time when if you want to explore things like low carb and carnivore, etc., it's there for you. The tribes are there, and there are people that are experiencing tremendous health benefits from eating low carb. So hopefully, you will realize that trying to have these discussions with your doctor probably ain't going to work. You're not going to convince them, but the studies are there. It's not rocket science, but maybe it's not worth spending what little time you have of your doc to go over this one. This is Kirk, the Bariatric Carnivore. I try to put out a couple messages each week. If you like this message, please hit like and subscribe. Join this channel of other like-minded folks. I will talk to you again soon.